There are stories the world forgets. And then there are stories the world buries, on purpose. Stories hidden beneath the marble floors of palaces, sealed inside letters that were never meant to be found, whispered between the walls of fortresses that still stand today, silent and proud, as though they carry no shame. But they do. They carry everything. This is one of those stories. A story of a king who had everything, and chose the one thing he could never have, a woman who loved him fully, completely, and at the cost of everything she was. A kingdom that watched, a court that plotted, and a fate so cruel, so final, that even centuries later, it echoes to the mountains of the frontier like a wound that never healed. They called him Amir Shah, the king of the frontier, the lord of the mountain pass, the man whose name alone made enemy generals pause before crossing his borders. He was not a king who had been handed his crown on a velvet cushion. He had earned it. He had bled for it. And by the time he sat on that throne at 32 years old, every soldier in his army would have followed him into fire. He was tall, dark-eyed, with a stillness about him that unsettled people who met him for the first time. He did not speak much in court. He observed. He listened. He calculated. His advisors feared his silence more than his anger, because his silence always meant he had already decided, and his decisions were rarely comfortable for those who opposed him. He had been married young, as all kings were. His queen was a woman of noble birth, selected by treaty, admired by the court, respected by the people. She was everything a royal wife was supposed to be, composed, elegant, loyal, and utterly alone in her husband's heart. He cared for her. He respected her. But he had never loved her. He had never loved anyone, until the winter the healer came to the palace. Her name was Zara. She was not of noble blood. She was a daughter of a physician from the eastern lowlands, a man who had spent his life studying herbs and remedies, who had built a quiet reputation healing the poor, who had died leaving behind nothing but his knowledge and his daughter. Zara had inherited both. She had been brought to the palace to treat the queen's mother, an elderly woman suffering from a lung illness that none of the court physicians could cure. Zara cured her in 7 days. The king first saw her in the garden, not in the grand receiving hall, not in a formal procession, but simply standing near the rose arbor in the early morning, her dark hair loose, her eyes closed, her face tilted toward the pale winter sun, as though she were listening to something the rest of the world could not hear. He stood at the upper corridor window and watched her for a long moment. He did not know who she was. He only knew that something shifted in him, quietly and completely, like a lock turning open after years of rust. He asked his chamberlain who she was. When he was told she was a healer, a commoner, a woman with no family name of significance, he said nothing. He nodded once and walked away. But he sent for her the next morning, under the pretense of a persistent headache that his court physicians had failed to relieve. It was the first lie Amir Shah had told since he was a boy. Zara came to the royal chamber without ceremony. She was neither nervous nor obsequious. She examined him with calm, professional eyes. She asked him questions about his sleep, his appetite, his stress. She prescribed herbs and resins, something that shocked him more than any battle report ever had. She told him, plainly and without apology, that he carried the weight of too many things alone, and that no remedy could fix a mind that refused to rest. No one spoke to the king like that. No one dared. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in years, he laughed. A real laugh, not the polished, diplomatic smile he wore at court, but something genuine and startled, as though it had escaped him before he could stop it. She did not flinch or blush or apologize. She simply waited until he was finished, and then she told him to drink his medicine. He called for her again 3 days later, and 3 days after that. The headache, he said, had not fully lifted. His chamberlain knew it was a lie. His chief adviser knew it was a lie. His queen, in her quiet, knowing way, knew it was a lie. But no one said anything, because no one dared. Over the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened inside the walls of that fortress palace. The king, who had spent his entire adult life being utterly unreachable, began to open. He told Zara things he had told no one, about the campaigns that haunted him, about the men he had lost, about the loneliness of a crown that everyone wanted to touch, but no one wanted to carry with him. And Zara listened, not with pity, not with reverence, but with the same steady presence she brought to everything, honest, unhurried, and entirely real. She told him about her father, about the villages she had traveled through, about the family she had helped and the one she had failed. She told him about the night her father died, and she sat alone in their small home, not knowing if she was a healer or an orphan or both. She told him she had learned that grief and purpose could live inside the same person at the same time. He listened to every word as though she were describing something he had always felt but never had language for. And somewhere in the quiet of those stolen hours, in the amber light of oil lamps and the scent of herbs and cold mountain air, they fell in love. Not the kind of love written in poems, not the sudden, dramatic kind, the slow kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that builds so quietly that by the time you notice it, it has already changed everything. But this was not a story the world would allow to be simple, because beyond the palace walls, things were moving. The Eastern warlords, who had long resented Amir Shah's power, were gathering. A coalition was forming. 3 regional lords who each controlled territories that, together, could cut off the kingdom's trade routes and starve it within a year. They had sent their own message to the court, a proposal. One of them had a daughter. A marriage alliance, they suggested, would end the tension, would secure the borders, would prevent a war. The chief advisor brought this proposal to the king with barely concealed urgency. The court nobles murmured. The queen's family, always watchful, observed the king's face carefully during the council session. And Amir Shah sat at the head of his long stone table, hands folded, eyes unreadable, and said he would consider it. That night he went to Zara. She already knew. News traveled fast inside palace walls, even the room of a healer. She was sitting by the small window, her hands still, her face composed, but her eyes gave everything away. He stood in the doorway for a moment before crossing the room and sitting across from her, close enough to speak in whispers. He told her he would not do it. He told her he had already decided. He spoke with the certainty of a man who had made up his mind about something that could not be undone, and she listened to all of it. And then she looked at him for a long time in that steady, unblinking way of hers, and she said, "You will do it, because you are a king before you are a man." He told her she was wrong. She told him she hoped she was. And that night, for the first time, they did not pretend that what lived between them was anything less than what it was. No walls, no titles, no distance. Just 2 people in a small lamplit room at the edge of a world that would never let them simply be. What happened next was not sudden. It was a slow tightening, the way a net draws close around something that never saw it coming. The chief advisor had been watching. A court lady in service to the queen had been listening at doors, and one of the warlord spies, already inside the palace, already deeply embedded, had been sending careful letters east for weeks. The story reached the warlords before the king even understood it had left the palace. And the warlords, sharp-eyed men who understood leverage better than they understood loyalty, made their move. They sent a second message. No longer a proposal. A warning. They knew about the healer. They knew about the meetings. And they made it very clear. If the king refused their alliance and continued his association with this woman, they would ensure the story spread to every allied kingdom, every neighboring court, every powerful family whose support the throne required. They would frame it not as love, but as weakness, not as devotion, but as dishonor. The king read the letter alone, in his chamber, at night. He sat with it for a very long time. Then he did something that no one expected, not his advisors, not the warlords, and not even Zara. He summoned the warlord's representative to court. He met him in the great hall, in full regalia, with his entire council present. And he told him, calmly, that the king of the frontier did not negotiate with threats. He told him to go home and tell his lords that the mountain pass had never fallen and never would. And he dismissed him. The court erupted. The advisors pleaded. The queen's family withdrew their cooperation from the treasury. The eastern warlords began moving troops. And Amir Shah, for the first time in his reign, chose something that was entirely his own and let the consequences come. But here is where history hides its cruelest chapter, because Zara heard what the king had done, and she understood, with a clarity that broke her quietly open, what it would cost. Not him, not yet. But she was a vulnerability. She was a point where every enemy would press their blade. As long as she was in that palace, she was the weapon they would use against him. And she loved him too completely to be the reason his kingdom burned. She left 3 days later, before dawn, a small bundle of medicines, a letter she had written and rewritten until the words were plain and straight, folded and left beneath the single candle on his study table. She did not say goodbye. She knew if she saw him, she would not leave. The king found the letter at sunrise. He read it once. Then he sat, perfectly still, for a very long time, the way he always did when he'd already decided something. And then he called for his fastest rider. He found her at the edge of the lower village, preparing to board a merchant cart heading east. He did not bring guards. He came alone on horseback, in plain riding clothes, looking more like a man than a king, and she looked at him from across the road with those steady eyes, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she said simply, "You shouldn't have come." And he said, "I know." He asked her to stay. She said she couldn't. He said he would give up the throne. She said she knew he didn't mean it, not because he was lying, but because he could not be someone who abandoned his people, and she had loved him partly for that reason. She told him she was not a tragedy. She told him she was a choice she was making, and that he should let her make it with dignity. He stood there in the early morning light, this man who had faced war and betrayal in the way of a crown without flinching, and he could not speak. He could not find a single word inside all that silence. The cart began to move. She did not look back. And Amir Shah, king of the frontier, lord of the mountain pass, watched the road until there was nothing left to watch. He accepted the alliance 6 months later. He married the warlord's daughter. The eastern border stabilized. The kingdom held. Historians would write of his reign as one of the most strategically sound of his era, a king who understood sacrifice, who chose duty over desire, who secured his people's future at every turn. But those who served in the palace in those final years spoke quietly of other things, of the king who kept a small oil lamp burning in his study every night until he died, of a letter Warren saw from Hamlet, found folded inside his chest armor when they prepared him for burial, of a single dried rose, not the kind grown in palace gardens, but the wild, small-petaled kind that grew near the eastern lowlands, pressed between the pages of his private journal, next to an entry that read only, "She was right. I was a king before I was a man. I am sorry I cannot be both." And Zara, the healer's daughter who had walked into a palace to cure an old woman's lungs and had, in doing so, changed the entire interior landscape of a king, she returned to the eastern lowlands. She opened a small practice. She treated the poor as her father had done. She never married. She lived a long and quiet life. And when she was very old, she was known in her village not as someone who had loved a king, but simply as a woman of extraordinary steadiness. Someone who listened when you spoke, who never flinched at the difficult truth, and who always seemed to carry something ancient and unspoken behind her eyes. She died in spring. The mountain flowers were blooming. And somewhere in the palace of the frontier, as the story goes, though no one can prove it now, the oil lamp in the king's old study flickered out for the first time in 30 years. Some loves are not meant to be lived. They are meant to be carried, quietly, completely, for the rest of a life. And sometimes that is the only kind of love that is truly real.